I think the same thing happens in therapy. The same thing happens in Christianity, where God is asking us to do things that are currently inaccessible to us. They're not currently within our realm of capability and capacity. So because we can't do those things, does he hold us accountable? I think he holds us accountable for the opportunities to grow.
Welcome back.
We are back.
You're back, not at the bar.
Again, we are two therapists behind a bar.
Yeah, you know what that means?
What does that mean?
It means that we have another guest on the podcast.
That is what that means, because we do not have a larger bar.
You guys need to get a larger bar.
We do. But maybe it's appropriate because we have with us a pastor today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why we're drinking water today.
Yes.
The couch is a little more appropriate for the pastor.
Holy water.
Holy water.
So, welcome, Reed.
It's good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. It means a lot.
Yeah, I've listened to the podcast, and now I get to be on it. It's fun.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you're the one.
I'm the one listener. It's not just your mom.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've known you, Reed, for, I don't know. I feel like I've known about you for longer. So when I moved into, to the Valley, Shenandoah Valley, I'd heard of you through my wife. And so I think I knew about you for at least a year or more before I met you. Mm-hmm. All good things.
Well,
I'm curious how long you guys have known each other.
Ooh. How long have we known each other?
probably 2012, maybe 13.
I think that's when we really became better acquainted. Was that time? I think we've known of each other.
Yeah.
Like we had different people that ran in different circles.
Right, because your sister was in school.
Yeah.
With me. So, but we moved back to the Valley like the very end of 2012, 2013.
Okay. Yeah. And so that it had to, it was probably 2013 because I think we got better acquainted once, with that whole house church movement that took place.
It was fun.
It was fun. It was a fun time. So it's been, I guess we're going a little over a decade now, which is wild.
Yeah. Mostly hikes and splitting wood and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Conversations.
Yes.
Over those activities.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There's some good conversations in there. So in the spirit of that,
yes,
we only thought it appropriate to be able to further delve into some of those things because, again, we've had a lot of good conversations. And I think in particular, there always is intermingled in some way this theme, I think, of, well, how does one rather bridge the gap between psychology and religion?
Mm-hmm.
But before we get too far, I'm curious, it sounds like it might be appropriate. Hey, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? Obviously, we already mentioned you're a pastor, but what do you do? Where are you from?
Yeah. So from the Valley originally, got to come back here, like we said, in 2013. Currently serving as lead pastor there at New Market Seventh-day Adventist Church on the campus of Shenandoah Valley Academy. And I see myself primarily as a follower of Jesus, and that happens to lead me to being a pastor right now.
Yeah. And
I just think, just want my life to center around him. He's amazing.
Yeah. Okay.
And,
yeah. All right. And how did you, why pastoring?
So it used to be I was going to be an architect. That was kind of the engineering, architecture. That was the
Did you
goal.
want to be that as like a little kid?
Oh yeah. So, and that's kind of a family tradition.
Okay.
So
No way.
uncle, grandfather. Yeah. I used to draw all these pictures of houses of kids and, math and all that stuff, design. But once I, as a teenager, had a sort of a conversion experience and started being involved in ministry, I just really started falling in love with just that purpose, that meaning, that value, that fulfillment it brought to myself, and then also just seeing, to know you can do something to benefit another human being in a way that impacts their life. I mean, what's better than that? And so just the whole desire for anything else just faded, and it was like, oh, here I am, like kind of by default. So started. I went to school for theology and started pastoring. Then went back and studied some more. But yeah, pastoring's not an easy thing. Always, people are rascals, as you know that. And
I don't envy your work.
Yeah,
and the rate of burnout is pretty high.
It is very high with pastors. Yeah. Very high. A lot of the guys I went to school with aren't pastoring anymore.
Really?
Yeah, huge percentage. So
I guess in that way that I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, because I feel that in some ways, what we do is very similar.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of similarities and crossover, and there are many times that I envy the skills and training that you all have, I mean, often I'm deferring and saying, hey, we need to get you, seeing a therapist or something like that. But there is a lot of, just dealing with people in the real issues of their life and walking with them through that, helping them to, experience healing and, the wellness that God intended. Yeah. So, I mean, there are times that pastoring is hard. There's things that I do that are just the job sort of it, that aren't the reason I, signed up. But then there's the other things that I do that I would do for free, even if I wasn't getting a paycheck.
And going back to the architecture piece, I've seen the excellence of your drawings and your artwork.
And excellence might be a little bit of an exaggeration.
Yeah. Well, I love how you creatively incorporate that part of yourself in your ministry. So like you do a lot of like sermon illustrations.
Right.
Yeah, so it's pretty cool.
Well, that's fun. Thanks for the compliment.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, I feel like that's an interesting segue when you said that you feel like a lot of our work intersects or is similar. Because, growing up in Africa, like the pastor is the therapist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Like there's no like counseling, therapy, that's still very relatively new culturally, especially at least for the older generation. I'd say here too, it's still not a thing.
No, I would say that you're more probably with people that are above 45. I would say most of them are more prone to go talk to their pastor or priest sooner than they would to a therapist.
Yeah. And I think in the West that is still true. Traditionally in Christianity, I think there's been some reluctance. I speak about Christianity, that's the vein of religion I'm in.
Yeah,
so
sure.
But there's been some reluctance to trust psychology and therapists. But so people will often come to see me, even here in the West, where I think there's even a little more trust than there might be in Africa or some other places for psychology and therapists. But there are church members who will come and see me. And I really have to work with them to try to help them to become willing to go see a therapist, because there's certain things I can talk with them about, but then there are also things that I feel like are out of my expertise or beyond just the scope of what I can help them with. And there's a lot of reluctance out there, unfortunately.
Yeah, right. And yeah, with that, so like even growing up, nobody ever brought up the idea of like, hey, David, you should consider being a therapist, right? Because again, like the pastor was the only person you went to for those kinds of things, and I didn't want to be a pastor.
Yeah.
And so, but then moving here, and even again, like with a younger generation, I feel like the culture has shifted where it's almost like the therapist is the new church.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Like this therapy is where I go for my healing, my home, just to feel whole.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like even like in your discussions with your congregants, and like how do you help them reconcile? Like, we're here at church, but you can also benefit from therapy.
Yeah.
Because I know one of the things I hear, at least from people who are more reluctant to go to therapy, is like, I feel like a lot of the things that I'm dealing with are spiritual in nature.
Right.
So why should I go to a non-spiritual source, or apparent non-spiritual source,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
someone who's just like, you're my pastor, like this is church, this is where I get it.
Yeah.
Like, is it something that, like, do I not have enough faith? Like, why do I now need to go to a
Right.
therapist, kind of thing?
Why
Or-
can't Jesus be enough? You know,
yeah,
to
right.
fix- yeah.
Yeah, and then it's like, I have a broken psyche. Why do I have to go to another human being with a broken psyche, or like a broken human for a healing that I believe is spiritual? Is like Jesus should give it to me,
Yeah.
or God.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe there's
That's a really good question. And it's something that people wrestle with all the time. Like, you know, kind of the Jesus, you know, just snap his fingers and heal me, and you know, sort of view. Maybe if I could actually zoom out just a little bit.
Totally.
So I think there is something very interesting about like psychology and therapy and religion in general, Christianity in particular, in that there are many ways there's a huge overlap for the area of study and the goals, right? So both are focusing on what we can't see and what we can't observe, right? You know, it's not like chemistry or physics or other things. We're focusing on, you know, the inner world for psychology of people and how they relate to other people's inner worlds, you know, in relationships. But that's not a world you can see, even if you know, dissect somebody and look at their brain. You
do a
can't
brain
see
scan.
it. You know, you can't. I mean, we can. You know, there's some things we can see with brain scans and things, but not really those thoughts, those feelings. You know, we can't actually observe them. And there's so much of Christianity that really is about what we can't see. It's about the spiritual world around us that we live in, that spiritual environment that is both external and internal to us. And how do we relate to that? How should we relate to that? What effect does it have upon us? And of course, God is a huge part of that spiritual world. But you know, in Christianity, we also believe that there's a divine side of the spiritual world, but there's also, you know, an evil side, and that we are in the midst of that. So I think in that sense, there's a huge overlap, the unseen, that has a huge impact upon us in our everyday lives. But then also, you know, I would say the goal of psychology is not just understanding. You can correct me if I'm wrong. It's not just to understand that unseen world and, you know, be able to describe it, but to be able to understand it in a way that we can actually help people experience, you know, greater well-being. You know, we want to understand it so that, you know, we know how to get to a better place as humans.
Yeah, I would say that you're bringing up a really good point there, in that there's this conflation between insight and change,
Yeah.
right? In the sense that, okay, like I think many, and perhaps much of therapy, unfortunately, puts a paradigm on the amount of insight that one can gain from the therapeutic process,
Yeah.
without putting any emphasis, or perhaps enough emphasis on, okay, how can this then facilitate a changing process in you to be functional? I would say that there is one piece, and perhaps this is where I think the bridges get met, so to speak. And unfortunately, I can't take credit for this idea solely, because I think C.S. Lewis put it very well. And so I'm going to pull this out here.
Quote him.
So he essentially in Mere Christianity, he has this chapter on morality and psychoanalysis. And he's trying to, essentially he's formulating an idea of, okay, I believe the way that I interpret this is he's formulating an idea of where one ends and the other begins.
Yeah.
Right. So he's saying, okay, put it this way. Imagine three men who go to war. One has the ordinary natural fear of danger that any man has, and he subdues it by moral effort and becomes a brave man. Let us suppose that the other two have, as a result of things in their subconscious, exaggerated, irrational fears, which no amount of moral effort can do anything about, i.e., okay, now we're dealing with perhaps psychology.
Right.
Right. And perhaps to a certain degree, we could argue that, okay, we could see this, we could observe this, that someone has an irrational fear, perhaps. And so it's like, all right, I don't know how to, like, my moral effort is not doing anything about this. Okay, so now suppose that a psychoanalyst comes along and cures these two. So they're able to perhaps take away this, okay, this distraction and perhaps this extreme fear, right? And obsession and compulsion towards certain mechanisms, right? So cures this, and essentially he puts them both back in the position of the first man who is without fear, quote unquote. Well, it's just then that the psychoanalytical problem is over and the moral problem begins. Right? Because now if you have two men, now they get to make a moral decision because perhaps they don't have fear.
Right.
The moral decision then comes into place where they go to the front lines. One can say, okay, I'm going to be brave now. I'm going to lay down my life for others. Another can say, well, I'm brave, but I'm still going to look out for number one. And to me, that seems like a really, I don't know.
Yeah.
He just did a good job.
I think he did a good job. Yeah.
And I'm wondering how much of this do you see? Do you agree with that, first of all, or do you feel like there's different pieces in there that are overlooked?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this overlap between the two, but there's also a distinction, and that morality piece, that sin piece, that we talk about in Christianity is probably one of the biggest distinctions, right? And maybe to kind of zoom out again just a little bit, like I think one of the other similarities between Christianity and psychology is that both, in a sense, have to assume some sort of ideal function, right? So you can't be dysfunctional unless you assume some sort of
standard.
Yeah, standard.
Sure.
So there's got to be some sort of standard. Now, I've taken like 2 psychology classes, so I don't know the philosophy of modern psychology. I'm guessing that probably the standard that most psychology operates today is sort of an evolutionary functionary standard.
Yes, I would say so. And I would say it's very much gone to a postmodern ideal with definitely evolutionary standard, and then also predicated on eliminating as much suffering as possible.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And very much like in practice, like you see that it's about feeling better.
Yeah. Yeah. So, which is interesting to me. So, why is well-being? Why is there a standard for well-being and function? In Christianity, we have what we would call the ideal specimen, right? We have an example of well-being in that we're created in God's image, and we're made to be modeled after Him as sort of the ideal specimen. And then, of course, Jesus shows up in the image of God, and we're to follow Him and be like Him, experience well-being in the way that He models it. So I think that there is a sense in Christianity where, in psychology, where there's some sort of ideal that we're striving for, but I think that in psychology that ideal is going to be limited to the kind of the modern definition of personal well-being, and really in Christianity, well-being is a byproduct of what the actual goal is. The actual goal is reconciliation with God, and then as you're with Him, you become more like Him, that ideal specimen, and that results in well-being. And so I think that, there's differences. Psychology can get you to experience wellness in certain areas, but I think there are certain areas where it doesn't really have sufficient tools to address, what's going on in somebody's life.
Yeah. So I guess that brings me to another question then. If it doesn't have, so again, let's say psychology, for example, doesn't have sufficient tools to address perhaps all of the spiritual side, or rather the morality side of things, does that mean that if somebody and I'm going to perhaps play devil's advocate here.
Let's go.
So in many cases, you may have somebody with perhaps a mental illness that's again, we could argue acting partly out of a mental illness, or there may be a gray area there.
Sure.
Let's say, okay, maybe they have.
Is there a spiritual side to what they're dealing with? Is that what you're saying?
Well, so where does that? I think more so like this might be a more direct question. Like, at what point are they sinning?
Yeah.
In your mind,
right?
Or held accountable for their actions,
right?
And where is that intersection in your mind? Like, how does Christianity rather see that?
Yeah.
Do you believe?
That's a really good.
I have my own opinions here, but I'm curious. Like for you, how do you?
So, I would say that, in a sense, Christianity views humans as dysfunctional and that are broken, and that the result, the sin is the result of our brokenness. So it's just, sin is really evidence of our separation from God, our being unlike Him, and that Christianity isn't so much concerned with, is this a sin or is this a sin? But it's to kind of restore that underlying condition that causes us to be what we don't want to be, and what, this to act broken. How does that, correlate? I think there are certain psychological dysfunctions that cause people not to be able to function wholly. Right? Not be able to treat people with respect or kindness, right? I mean, if somebody is borderline or histrionic,
throwing out some big words there.
And as a pastor, you have to learn some of these things, right?
Sure.
Like,
Oh, for sure.
and you have to sit down with somebody and what is their capacity to to actually be empathetic with, the brother in the church that they're having a struggle with, or something like that. And I mean, sometimes I think that these psychological conditions are primary in, the brokenness that we see. That, somebody really needs to deal with some of those things. But I don't think they're always primary. And I think that it gets mixed up together in ways that it's almost impossible to parse out. How much of that is, the predisposition to selfishness and sin in somebody. I mean, one of the things that I've, always wondered and wished I had a better insight on was the interplay between mental illness and what in Christianity is viewed as spiritual affliction or demon possession, that sort of thing.
Right.
That's hard to parse out, because I have seen things that, there's some mental illness there, but I don't think it's just mental illness.
Sure.
And so I think there are some ways that these things overlap that it's really hard to know how to separate them. I mean, it's not a clean distinction between psychology and spirituality, because we're created as whole beings, right? And our minds affect, it interflows with each other.
No, and I think that's a very interesting thing to point out, because ultimately I think people, perhaps the reaction naturally when someone hears, okay, well, I think perhaps there's mental illness, but then perhaps also some demon possession going on, or something to where there's a spiritual work at play, to where people I guess the word the kids use these days is cringe.
Yeah,
it's like they're like, "Whoa, are we going there? Really? Are we really saying that?" But yet at the same time, you could sit down at coffee with them and they'd be like, "Oh man, my house is haunted with a ghost."
And
then you really sit down and you're like, "Do you really believe that? Like, do you actually believe that?
Right.
Like, do you believe that your house is haunted with a ghost? Your ancestor is there?"
Sure.
And perhaps some do, and or they're totally acceptable to have this notion in mind, but then you bring up the idea that, well, no, there may be some spiritual affliction here in addition to what's happening here. Or let's say they're hesitant to think of things from that lens, but they're okay with the lens of, hey, maybe I'll get some spiritual direction instead of speaking to a pastor.
Right, sure.
But I want spiritual direction.
Yeah.
Right? And so there seems to be some duality there in how we prime our minds for that. But I think ultimately, I don't have an answer to that either.
Yeah.
I think it's very curious, because I remember even in my time in Africa, that there was moments at which I remember being with this woman who was claiming to be a witch doctor, and she started like convulsing on the ground, but yet some of it seemed very put on, but also was very real to her in the moment and very real to the people. And perhaps, I don't know, maybe I was approaching this the wrong way, but I almost didn't even take it seriously.
Yeah, sure.
Like I was just like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah.
Like, now granted, like the villagers were very concerned about what was happening. And I do remember praying for this woman.
Yeah.
But not because I felt that there was
Actual possession or
actual
something.
possession happening.
Right.
I'm not trying to dismiss that, because there's certainly cases to things that I cannot explain at all.
Right.
And make no sense to me. However, it would seem that perhaps there's still two things at work. Maybe there is, and I guess maybe we're like, if there's spiritual forces, perhaps maybe we're underestimating how those actually function.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And I think we've got to have a little bit of a devil with a pitchfork and a pointed tail, sometimes view of possession that is looked down upon and kind of mocked in our society. And I think also just the sense that it's only psychology and not spiritual feels safer to people, right? There's a sense that, cracking the door to that spiritual realm is a bit frightening. But why, if somebody is hearing voices, why do those voices always give messages that are self-destructive? I've never met somebody who is hearing voices and the voices have a positive impact upon them in their life. Maybe you guys have. I don't know.
So I would say typically it's there. No, I think that's a great point. I can't say that in clinical work that I have encountered that. Typically when there is voices, there's something more negative about them. But when there's something more positive, it's actually an internal self-belief that I am king.
Right. Oh yeah.
Like,
So,
right,
well,
right.
even destructive in a
But it really not.
But it's inflated.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's not
way
for their
beyond-
benefit.
Yeah,
No.
It still is not for their benefit. Exactly.
it's
So-
destructive. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I have family members, who, believe that they're Spider-Man or, Jehovah. I mean, there's this inflated voice, but it's not to their benefit. I mean, it brings them real harm. And so what I'm saying is that, okay, there's a psychological dynamic. Absolutely. But somehow, why is that psychological dynamic bent in a certain way that's destructive?
Sure.
Does psychology have an answer for that? I don't know.
I think the fundamental answer would be a biological dysfunction.
Yeah.
Right. It would attempt to describe it by, okay, well, this is a male adaptation or something of that
Yeah,
nature
yeah.
that is going wrong. It's like pulling a muscle or something of that
Yeah.
nature, but it's happening in your brain, and it is that simple. We just have to place the right chemicals in the right areas, and you will be fine.
Yeah. But I guess, I guess kind of what I'm trying to say is that from an evolutionary perspective, there should be bad accidents and happy accidents, right? There's these happy accidents that cause us to evolve and progress as a species. But from a psychological perspective, I don't see happy accidents happening in people. I see dysfunction that is taking them away from function and wholeness. That ideal, whether that's a psychological or a Christian ideal. Why is it bent that way and not the other way? I think there's some spiritual things at play that are really hard to understand. And I'm not saying that mental illness is all it's all spiritual and it's demon possession and there's no psychological. I think there's a huge psychological portion. But what I'm saying is we can't count out the spiritual dimension, because somehow maybe there's a psychological weakness that cracks the door to, being spiritually vulnerable in a way that, that wellness, somebody who was experiencing wellness, that door wouldn't be open. I don't know.
Yeah, I see a huge interrelatedness between the two, in the same way that the early scientists, the reason why they delved into science was because they were spiritual, right? It's like what C.S. Lewis says is that, they wanted to study the laws of nature because they believed in an inherent lawgiver, right? And so it's like, even with psychology, it's like, because one can believe in the spiritual, that it's like psychology is a means to understand some of the things that maybe we might not fully understand, but at least maybe this helps us, right? Because I think there's the tangible, like you said, there's that tangible negative impact that one can, even even if we understood it as like this is a biological manifestation, the impact of it, this is not something we can just simply explain psychologically. Like, this is, you're harming other people, and you're harming yourself in a way that's just like, is like, just, we all know like this is sad, right? And that's, I think, the spiritual piece is like the results of this dysfunction is causing so much harm in a way that I think spiritually that's the way we can understand at least not harm. And then like going back to the accountability piece, there's I can't claim credit to this, but there's a guy called Joe Nushi. He's a therapist, and he talked about like the difference between having the capacity, like I think you mentioned capacity, is like, okay, if they don't have the capacity, then how responsible can we hold them?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so if they don't have the capacity, then what do we do? They might not be intending to cause harm, but they still impact. There's a difference between intention and impact.
Absolutely.
So we need to manage the impact. But then if they have the capacity to take responsibility, then that's a whole different situation too.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where I think people sometimes struggle.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some very like intellectual disabilities. I think people are very understanding. Like, this person doesn't understand that they're doing maybe evil things towards others or themselves, but maybe there's some other mental illnesses that I think it's kind of blurred.
Yeah. Sure.
Well, and I think it's where. So I think humans inherently are able to pick up on perhaps what we might describe as a intellectual disability, right? Versus a maladaptive behavior in how we interact with human beings.
Right.
Right? Because I think that those two things can exist like on the same hand, but independently, in the sense that you could have someone that's perhaps been raised in a very broken home, and the way that they were raised and begin to understand how to interact with people from a very young age is only in one specific manner, which is perhaps extremely maladaptive and very manipulative. And as a count of that, right, the way that they function and exist within their relationships is as such. Now we might be able to say, okay, the right moral thing to do is to act this way.
Right.
However, out of habit and pattern, right, now we're set up very differently because we can't just simply say, okay, well, I'm going to do this, because our response is now Pavlovian, right? Like, in which we are primed and trained to respond in these ways, which arguably could be observable to a certain point.
Yeah, sure.
I think I'm curious though, what do you believe? At which point does God hold people accountable?
Yeah.
I'm just going to cut.
No pressure.
Cut right
No
to the
pressure.
chase.
Right.
And I believe that that's slightly nuanced, but I'm curious. I want to hear how you would, how you might describe that to someone coming to you to say, hey, at what point, like, Pastor Reed, like, at what point am I held accountable for this? Or like, I don't know how to alter this. Does God hate
I'm
me?
stuck. I'm addicted, whatever. I can't change this, this behavior, and I've tried, how accountable am I? I've got this dysfunction, whatever it is. So I think one is that we have to understand that growth and change in in Christianity, you guys know this inherently as therapists, but in Christians, we have to remind ourselves this. It doesn't happen in an instant. It's not a light switch. God doesn't have some big lever in the sky. You pray a prayer, he flips the lever, you're good to go.
All right, I'm going to pause you. So how do you deal with folks that perhaps read the Bible and see these miracles that Jesus did and say, well, I know he can heal me.
Yeah.
I know he can do this.
Right,
Am
right,
I not praying hard enough? Why doesn't he do it right now?
Yeah. So,
or at least
okay.
for me.
For me,
I've seen
yeah,
doing it in
absolutely,
other
absolutely.
people's
Yes,
lives.
exactly.
So, this is a really good question, and it's a difficult thing for a lot of people because we wrestle with this, right? We have a conviction of what we want to be or what we feel God wants to be, and there's a disparity between our reality and why doesn't God make up the difference? Why doesn't God, he raised the dead. He created, ex nihilo just by speaking words. Why doesn't he just do it? And the truth is, I believe that God isn't looking, to be a vending machine where he doles out blessings and healing and transformation. I think he's looking for partnership. Jesus uses the analogy of "take my yoke upon me," and this analogy is the analogy of two. A yoke is what causes two oxen to be able to work together alongside one another. And so he's, when he says take his yoke, he's not the farmer with the whip. He's saying, I'm on the other side of the yoke. Join me, and we're going to pull together. We're going to work together, and
We're going to work
together. And he says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. That's counterintuitive because yoke is for work. It's for pulling heavy loads. That's why it's for a load that one ox is not capable of pulling. So you need two. It's the whole purpose of it is to pull and do heavy things. He says, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light," because as you are yoked to him, you are watching him pull, learning how he pulls. You're becoming in sync with him. You're developing muscle memory, and you are gradually, as you're with him, becoming more and more like him. And that's a process. So that as you guys, when you work out, there are things that you can do now that you never used to be able to do before. A weight that you can now lift with relative ease that you couldn't have done before. You take any sort of athletic or music, anything that we learn and are capable of doing. If somebody told me right now, Reed, you need to go run a 100-mile race right now, I could try, but I wouldn't succeed, right? I maybe I could walk the whole thing. I could probably do that, but I couldn't run 100 miles in a day. Yeah. But if over the next months and years, I started training and running, I could get to the point where I can do what was impossible for me to do previously. And I think the same thing happens in therapy, the same thing happens in Christianity, where God is asking us to do things that are currently inaccessible to us. They're not currently within our realm of capability and capacity. So because we can't do those things, does he hold us accountable? I think he holds us accountable for the opportunities to grow, to be able to come to the place where we can be the sorts of people that actually do those sorts of things, where we can be the sorts of people that actually can act like Jesus. I can't just do that in an instant, but I have opportunities to grow toward that. I have opportunities to do the work, to be connected and to be surrendered, to get to the place gradually where I'm a different sort of person. I can run that 100 miles. I can play that violin. I can forgive. I can, I can be empathetic. I can deal with my anger in a healthy sort of way. I don't get there overnight. I've got to grow toward it. And I think that's really what the view that Christianity has. You're accountable, I really feel like, not so much for the sins, but for becoming the sort of person that through Jesus, through the Spirit, that can act differently and behave differently.
So when you say you're accountable, do you mean that you're accountable on a spiritual level, or do you mean that it's okay for you to keep doing, like, so for instance, if someone, I don't know, let's say they had anger issues and they beat their wife.
Yeah.
Right. They're trying to become more patient. They believe that God is taking them to this place to become more patient, but they, Pastor Reed, beat a tattoo out on my wife last night.
Yeah.
Right. I'm trying to get better.
Right.
Not quite there yet.
Yeah.
Like, at what point does that intersection change for you as a pastor or spiritually in that context?
Yeah. Certainly there's accountability for action, and there's choice. Absolutely.
Where do you see that biblically?
Yeah. Okay.
So, I love it. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, what I love about the Bible is that there is record after record of broken people.
Sure.
You have so few good examples of right action in the Bible. I mean, Jesus, right, is the kind of the shining breath of fresh air you get out of the Old Testament, and you're like, oh, thank you, God, that there's some good decisions and some healthy maturity going on. Yeah. But what is also fundamental to the Bible is there's never an excuse for sin. I mean, it's very honest about the brokenness, right? I mean, there's brokenness everywhere you look, but you never find this place in the Bible where it's like, oh, well, they're just human, that, that's okay. Where like there's sort of the standard or the ideal is somehow brought down, and now we accept dysfunction. And we're okay with it because it's just the world we live in, the environment we live in, and people can't help it. That's not there in Scripture. There all the way through is this high standard of following God, obeying. Sin. It's not seen as this changeable standard. It's there in spite of the persistence of human brokenness. So I think absolutely there's accountability. There's accountability. And, for that husband who is, beating his wife, who has the anger issues, yes, there's accountability in the moment, but are you willing to surrender and put in the spiritual work to become a different sort of person for your wife? And if they say, I'm trying, but I'm not really willing to put in the work, I question whether they're really sincere about the trying.
So in my experience when dealing with, on the pathological side, when dealing with people like that, typically it's, oh, I'm trying, and I'll do what I can. And typically it's a very, because there's a large area of self-deception.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the problem is not inherently with them.
Yes.
And therefore they do not need to be removed from the scenario, and nor do they need to be held accountable for their actions.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious for you as a theologian and as a pastor, it's like, okay, how do you approach that juxtaposition?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think, when you say, this realization, they don't see the problem as them. This is absolutely fundamental to Christianity in that when we see our sin and we repent of it, we're not just saying, Lord, I'm guilty of an action. I had a temporary slip and I beat my wife, right? Why is that always an example? I don't know.
I was actually trying to find one that I wasn't going to use.
That's like the classic example. Okay.
I have a different example, but let's go with that.
Okay. We apologize. Sorry for going back to that.
No, it's okay.
Worn example. All right. So,
no, it's a good example.
But so to truly repent in Christianity is to not only take responsibility for the sin and the action, but take responsibility for, I am the type of person that can do this. And there's something fundamentally flawed and broken in me. That it's not just my actions that are wrong, that I am wrong. in my inner core and in my inner depth, there is something about the way I'm relating to myself and my other people that is broken and needs to be replaced and changed and converted. And to have that fundamental realization brings us to the point where now we are open to the gospel and to the work that God wants to do. But that's the entrance fee to get in the door. I mean, I don't think God can do much with us until we realize the depth of our brokenness and the depth of our need, and that it's not just these superficial actions. And I can just, maybe I'll just, modify my external behaviors a little bit, and people fail at that all the time. There's something deep that has to happen. And that is not a fun realization to realize, it's not just the circumstances. It's not just whatever that is why I did this awful thing, but to take full responsibility for, I'm the type of person that can do these awful things, and that needs to be worked on.
So is that then what you would say to someone?
Probably not like that.
Okay, fair enough.
But
Fair enough.
I mean, that's ultimately where I think you try to lead them.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there are a lot of roadblocks to getting there. And it's something very fundamental, but we like to blame shift. We like to, make excuses and see our defects as superficial.
Sure. David, you had a better example, I think, or another.
Oh,
so
well,
I'm curious- I'm
it's
curious to
kind
know.
of it's different in the sense of like more so, someone who is dealing with like long-term like depression,
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
right?
absolutely.
And they feel like because they're like they get into their moods, they can't fully be there
Yeah.
for their family, their kids,
Right.
So they hit slumps and lows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they can see the tangible ways they can't show up
Yeah.
for themselves and others in their lives, right?
They feel
And it's-
guilt about it because
Yeah.
they're not.
Yeah, they feel guilt about it, and it's like I have so much potential. I feel like it's being
Yeah.
wasted, and I'm like seeing the tangible impacts of that.
Yeah.
And it's like, where is that? Like, how do I reconcile that spiritually for myself?
Yeah, these are like the types of people like that you sit in the office with and talk with, and there's a spiritual side of it. And I'll just say, if someone came to me with that sort of challenge, probably my response is going to be twofold. One, realizing that there were some spiritual people in the Bible that are held up as examples who really struggled with depression. And you look at the Psalms. Man, David, there's depression, there's PTSD. I mean, it's very honest, very raw, very real. There's anger at God. There's sometimes, Lord, I wish I wasn't born, sort of, kind of talk. And he's taking that, and he's being very honest and open with God about that reality of his inward state. He's not denying it. He's not, trying to pray a prayer that he thinks God wants to hear. He's saying, this God is who I am, and he's very real, very honest. That's the sort of relationship he has with God, and he's processing through that, that inner reality. And there's a lot of roadblocks to people spiritually to get to that place, because we feel like we've got to pray kind of these platitudes, and we pray how we feel like God wants us to pray, which is really Christian tradition. It's not biblical, but God wants us to pray in a certain way. Faith looks a certain way. Faith has kind of this chipper face, and so that's what we have to be like when we pray. But you read Job, you read the Psalms. I mean, Jesus in Gethsemane, and I mean, there's raw, real emotion that's coming out in an unashamed way before God, and they're processing it with him. So if somebody comes to me dealing with this depression, I mean, we'll talk about it, and as we talk about the spiritual side, often try to help them to be able to deal with their depression in an honest way with God. And that doesn't mean God didn't snap his fingers and take it away from David, but often in the Psalms, there's these Psalms of lament that have this flow to them where David is pouring himself out to God. And then by the end, it's like the energy of the storm has been spent. And like the sun comes out and he's like, but I will, put faith in you, but I will trust you, and there's kind of this even though sort of sentiment that I think is hard to get to if you can't really express to God what's really going on. And the second thing I do is I just refer them to a therapist.
That's good. I'm curious with that because on another note here, kind of shift, not necessarily shifting, but shifting. So I'm wondering how much you see this because from say clinically, we could do a Google search right now and look at things that predispose people for things like OCD.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Obsessive compulsive disorders.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of those things is ultra conservatism.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
And particularly conservative traditions.
Yeah.
Spiritually.
Yeah.
And religiously. And so among those, like Catholics are fairly high, Orthodox Judaism, right? And Adventist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so I'm wondering, one, how often do you feel that you see things akin to spiritual OCD in the context of saying, I just feel that if I don't pray right, or if I don't follow things just so, right? And do you see that?
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Because obviously our clinical literature points to this.
Yeah.
Right. I've seen this, but I'm wondering, like, as a pastor, do you see this, and what is that like for you?
Yeah.
And would you equate legalism with spiritual OCD, or do you think there are any differences?
Yeah, there's
some overlap for sure. Absolutely. I think sometimes there can be differences. But yeah, I mean, shame and guilt can be powerful forces in people's life to modify behavior. And it happens in Christianity far too often, where the basis of religion becomes performance, right? And am I performing? And again, Christianity would say that performance is the fruit; it's not the root. The fundamental problem is that there is this disconnection, this separation from God, that has led to this brokenness. And so Christianity, the purpose of Christianity is not to be performance in order to feel good about myself and to make myself acceptable in God's sight. I mean, is often lived out and preached and practiced that way, but Christ's grace and his performance is at the very heart and center of Christianity, and it's supposed to be freeing in the sense that I don't have to please God. God is already for me. He's already pleased with me because I'm his child. He has died while I was yet sinners. While I'm crucifying him, he's saying, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And so there's already this umbrella of grace that I can live under, and I'm not actually trying to modify my behavior in order that behavior modification isn't the means to the end. The behavior modification is simply the end is this reconciliation to this relationship, and that end changes the way that I function, the way I treat myself, the way I treat people, how I live my life. But it gets really distorted, and people get it flipped around. And legalism, absolutely, I mean, it can grind somebody down, mentally and spiritually, compulsive behavior, and not just the way they treat themselves, but the way they treat other people, right? I mean, it can be so toxic. And there is something, I don't know, I've never read a study on this, but there is something in that I've seen just anecdotally in dealing with people, in that often extreme legalism and some sort of psychological dysfunction seem to go hand in hand. And what's the root and what's the fruit? I don't really know, but I've seen it time and time again where, is it somebody has some sort of PTSD and some other sorts of psychological dysfunction that, they've got a narcissistic personality, whatever it is that, does it incline them toward legalism, or is legalism, a very ingrained framework that, some of these other things are, it's causing dysfunction in other areas of their life. But there is certainly an overlap there.
Yeah, it's interesting because it goes back to what you're saying is like, that's that's the thing, like Jesus was trying to like push back against, like with the Pharisees back in the day, in terms of like their ultra conservatism. I think this is my theory, is that you see it a lot in ultra conservatives, like communities, spiritual traditions, because there's the institutional structures in place where there's a huge vulnerability,
absolutely,
for you to fall into that.
Absolutely.
And whereas maybe because you also see forms of legalism on like maybe other like sides of the spectrum where how politically correct do I need to be to make sure I'm being a good citizen, right? But it's not as like institutional. Well, maybe some people would say it's like now, the cancel culture and everything, right? Sure. So it's like, I got to be careful what I say. I got to be like, how do I know if I'm like, and then to get overthinking, right? So like you see the manifestations of it, but I think like because of the church and stuff, we have the structures in place where it's like it's easy to point it out. Absolutely. But and then also, on the liberal side too, it's like the other struggles is like lack of meaning and direction. Versus here, it's like I'm trying to create this like sense of meaning within myself. But I'm attaching it to a spiritual ideal that I'm crushed under the burden of it because it's never mine to carry in the first place.
Absolutely. Yeah. And where does my value come from? I think that's a very fundamental question to any person, any worldview. And our actions are valuable, but is that the source of our value? And I would say it's fundamentally not, that our value is found someplace else. And that understanding that can liberate and redeem our performance. But I think we gotta have things in the right order of importance and priority. What's the end and what's the means to the end?
Well, so I'm curious, and I'm kind of taking this on a slightly different track here, but as a pastor, I'm curious how. So many people, perhaps whether they're new to Christianity or getting introduced to it for the first time, or say they visit church, they may be very turned off to the idea of reading the Bible and then trying to make some sort of rational or psychological sense of it.
Right.
Simply because perhaps they interpret it literally, or they interpret what God says literally, or what people say of God literally. I'm curious, in your perspective and perhaps how you teach, how is the Bible even to be interpreted? Like, for instance, like we think about like what David said, like these vacillations of depression and happiness and sadness. Is that then saying that, okay, like this is how people should live? Right. Or is that simply providing an example of human behavior? Is the Bible just an example of human behavior overall, and that's all it is, and we're not supposed to then take things from that? Or at what point does that intersection?
Like, is it like descriptive versus prescriptive?
Yes, exactly. So that's the right language. Thank you. So is it that? Because I think too, for instance, And you can tell me, though he slay me, still
Yeah,
will I
yeah.
serve him.
Right.
Right? Is God slaying him?
Right,
Like, is
right,
that
right,
what's
right.
happening?
Yeah,
Is God
yeah.
slaying people?
Right, right.
What is happening here?
And yeah, because you better get to that
Hey
place
man,
because
in
he's gonna
modern
slay
terms,
you.
the word "slay" is a very positive.
Oh, that's
term.
true, man.
Like,
right?
bro, you are
There-
slaying
yeah.
right now.
God is slaying it.
God is
not-
slaying right now.
I'm not sure he intended that. Like, maybe
It was
Right,
prophetic.
because like we even use like even the language is
Right?
that's like
actually, it's applied for all time.
It's prophetic language. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my take on the Bible is that much of it is simply descriptive, and that we have way more bad examples than we have good.
Right.
And one of the things I actually love about the Bible is that it's very honest. So you would think that if quote unquote God's people are going to write this story, they would include all the good things that they did and conveniently leave out all the bad things that they did.
Right. The hunter always kills the lion.
Right.
Story.
The victor gets to write history, right?
Yeah.
And so, but that's not what you find.
No.
It's a train wreck. It's an absolute train wreck.
Yeah.
And what I love is the honesty in which it depicts people in their very real struggles. I mean, you read the book of Judges, it's painful, right? I mean, there are stories in
Not
there.
a kid's bedtime story.
No, do not read it. Do not read the Levite's concubine to your kids. Like,
Yeah, no.
it's horrific.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we're supposed to feel. We're supposed to see this is life apart from God. This is life, on its own. This is what sin actually is. And sin is this kind of pernicious, insidious sort of thing that it's not just God snapping his fingers and it goes away. So I think that understanding that when you approach the Bible, but also I would say understanding that the Bible is a bunch of stories, but there is a direction. I like to use the phrase, the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus, meaning all these little snippets of brokenness, these experiences, the covenant, all of these things, there's actually a trajectory to them that culminates in Jesus. And when you get to Jesus, if you start in Genesis and you go through, Abraham's story and Judges and all the exile and all these things, and you wander through all this brokenness, Jesus really is a breath of fresh air.
Sure.
There's like this sense, and I think we're supposed to feel that way. I think we're supposed to see, we've seen how it doesn't work, and all of the human religion and dysfunction and sin and whatever, and let's now have God give us himself personally an example of how it's supposed to work. So I think kind of reading it that way I have found helpful. There's certainly parts of the Bible that are confusing. It's a hard book. There's things that are disturbing. There's parts I don't understand, and I've been studying it for years and taking classes and things. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have incredible value and worth, and isn't transformational. I think there's so much that we can understand, and that I do understand that I've found to be incredible.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's I'd say similar for myself. So how would you advise someone who has maybe like been like church hurt? And maybe it's because of a mental illness or something else.
Yeah.
And or maybe somebody experiences mental illness and they're spiritual, right? They're a Christian, but they fear trusting themselves with a spiritual community
Yeah.
to gain support
Absolutely.
from them, right? So there's this idea of like nobody's real, nobody's vulnerable.
Sure.
Yeah,
People are not, why should I involve myself with a church or bring myself to a church, right? And then, there's the arguments of like, some people will be, I think, tone deaf and just be like, well, you don't come to church for others, you come to church for Jesus. And it's like,
Sure.
yeah, but I'm not just going to surround myself with people who don't care.
If I go to church for Jesus, then I can go to a room in my closet for Jesus. Just as
Right,
well.
right,
Like,
right,
what's
right.
the-
Like that's not.
The community's got to serve some purpose.
Yeah.
And
Or it would seem that that's what it was. Is that what it's meant for?
Right.
Or
Yeah.
like-
Isn't that what it's meant for?
It's not just a movie theater. Like we're all sitting in the same space watching, and no, there's a purpose for the community, and I would say that Christianity has not often done well in living out the purpose for those who are experiencing mental illness and psychological dysfunction. There's been shame and blame and misunderstanding, and well, if you just prayed a little harder, read your Bible a little more, God would flip the switch and these things would disappear. And
follow the treatment plan.
Right, follow the treatment plan, or if you had enough faith, you would not feel this way. You need to ignore those and just have faith and kind of grit your teeth. And I think some of these sorts of, maybe they're well-intentioned, but they're hurtful.
Is that kind of like the story of Job?
Yeah, his friends, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, absolutely. Job's friends, obviously Job went through incredible trauma. I mean, unspeakable. And the best thing his friends did was keep their mouths shut for 7 days. And they're just there, in silent empathy, weeping with him.
And then they unleash on him.
The moment they open their mouths, it's torment for Job. I mean, it twists the knife. And I actually think if you read the book of Job, there's a spiritual dimension. One of his friends says, I saw something in a dream. The Spirit came and spoke to me. And then he relates this message that the Spirit gave him in a dream. And it's basically piling guilt on top of Job.
Sure.
And so there's a sense where the devil is, in the backdrop of Job, causes the loss, but then is using Job's friends to twist that knife.
And
unfortunately,
that's happened a lot. Like I hear people say, like, yes, this person came up to me and was like, God told me you need to do this.
Yeah.
Like, you need to think.
And it's so toxic.
Right. And it's like, but they said God told them.
Yeah.
So is it, am I not listening? Right.
Yeah.
You have pierced ears, you're going to hell.
Yeah. No, and the church has been Job's friends way too often. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It would be better for us to simply be with somebody and support them in silence and through the ministry of presence than to open up our, I'll say, damned mouths. And I say that not as a curse word. I say that in the full meaning of the word. We hurt people. We hurt people who are already hurting. And they're coming to the church, for hope, for healing, for support. And we really, we do the devil's work. And first thing I guess I want to say is just on behalf of Christianity, for whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. We have messed up so many times in that regard. But not everybody's that way. And so I just experienced the loss of my sister. My sister had mental illness and died by suicide. Incredibly painful. I mean, yeah, I'm getting a little choked up here. And the church has been everything to me. I mean, just the way people have surrounded us, and the empathy, and just the support and the care and the prayers, and food, and even helping to cover her expenses for the burial, and just, I mean, it's it's really been breathtaking. And I've seen the worst of what church can be, but I've also seen it, pretty good. And so I do believe that there are followers of Jesus out there who are trying to, be the sort of people that he, wants them to be, and that's like him. And there is actual community out there that is healing. It's not perfect, and that's not the point, but it's supportive, and it's healing, and it can be profoundly transformational in somebody's life. I mean, the work that we have to do to experience wellness and well-being, I don't think we can do it alone. I think that's why, therapists can be so valuable, is because I think often we can't do it alone, and that accountability, that support, that, all of those things that, that a truly loving, supportive community can provide, man, it's priceless. It's absolutely priceless. So I would say to somebody, I'm so sorry for your hurt, but don't give up. That's not the church as Jesus envisioned it. And I do believe that there are pockets out there where people are trying to live it out and are doing it better than what a lot of people have experienced.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a common adage. Is that how you say it? Adage. That we're hurt in community and we heal in community.
Yeah.
I actually have never heard that.
That's a great phrase.
That is a great phrase.
I'm going to use it. I love it.
Yeah. I've never heard
Absolutely.
Right, because it usually
It's true.
Yeah, right. Because you usually think that because I'm hurt this way by these people, then I should distance myself from people. Right?
I can heal by myself.
Alone. Don't heal with those people. That right. Maybe you need to surround yourself with some different people.
Absolutely.
Right? And have remodeled.
Get new friends.
Yeah, like remodeled versions of what's healthy. But it's still community that's required.
Yeah.
And I think therapists will, most therapists encourage that.
Yeah.
Even church, like they'll encourage church. I think it's just like practically some people don't know how to go about it in such a way that it's like, okay, I'm surrounding myself with like
it seems like
people.
Anytime, and I think perhaps, and maybe Reed, you can illustrate your opinion on this too. I think that one of the reasons that the idea of Christianity is hard for people from a psychological perspective is that it makes a standard.
Yeah.
It has a standard for human behavior.
Yeah.
Right. You brought it up at the very beginning, like this ideal.
Right.
Right. And then it tells you, well, you can't reach it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And I don't say that. I say that partially tongue in cheek.
No, it's true.
It's true. It's part of the purpose, right?
I mean, that's part of the process, right? I mean, there's kind of this like, okay, there is this standard, this ideal. And then the next realization is you cannot get there on your own, and by the way,
it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Which is actually a freeing thing. But, until you get to that step, you're in the camp of legalism, trying to get there on your own, which can be a very oppressive, burden to bear. But the truth is that we all have standards. It's not like anybody, if I'm going to say, okay, I don't like Christianity because it's got standards, I'm going to, live on my own completely free of any standards. I've met people who talked that way. I've never met somebody who lived that way. I've never met somebody who is completely free of any standard that they or society or culture imposes upon them. It's not reality. We all have.
Lewis agrees with you.
Yeah, we all have standards, and I think that the fact that there is this sense. I mean, where does psychology get the idea of function versus dysfunction, right? Sure. There is something ingrained in us that sees and identifies and knows wrong and knows it's wrong. And we can say, yeah, that's not the way that people are supposed to live. That's not the way that, it should work. So that standard's there. Now, is the standard a little bit more defined in Christianity? Absolutely. We believe that it's not just the intrinsic knowledge of that standard, but that there's revelation that helps us to understand it. That, for instance, one of the things that you could maybe get to generally in Christianity, but not without Christianity, but Christianity makes specific, at least the version of Christianity that I'm a part of, is Sabbath rest, right? So we all know we need rest.
Sure.
We all know that we can't work infinitely and experience well-being. Christianity gives us a specific toward that. So you've got a standard. You've got a recognition that we are incapable of meeting that standard on our own. And if it was just that, and that's the version a lot of people experience of Christianity, just those two things, right? Yeah. An impossible standard. And I mean, who wants that, right? That's like the most uninspiring thing. but Christianity would say that's why Jesus came and stepped in, because he said, you can't do it without me. Let me not only show you the way, give you the example of the standard, but let me be the way. And let me, let's put this yoke on both of our shoulders, and let's experience transformation through me. And so Christianity has hope, not just the standard, not just the realization of reality, but hope that there can be change, that I can be the type of person that I long to be, that I want to be, and that I can be transformed. And of course, that hope in Christianity extends beyond just this life.
Sure.
But unfortunately, not everybody gets all that full version of Christianity.
Well, I think it's interesting too that you talk about, Jesus coming, showing the way, being the way. It's interesting too, because I think within the course of human history, like, humans have this knack for telling stories and creating myths and legends of heroes.
Right, absolutely.
Right, the hero's journey.
The hero's journey, right? Yeah. Like, I think like the most classical one is like Superman.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Like, I think of like Russell Crowe during, Man of Steel is like, you will give them something to strive for, right? Like, and so it's very, I would say, quintessential. And
there's so much analogy with Man of Steel too.
Oh man, like it's
the
unreal.
Jesus story.
Yeah, it's unreal. Yeah. It's unreal. But it seems that people, in so many ways, that's just not exciting enough to think about Jesus
as
a God.
Yeah.
He dies.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a major battle. There wasn't anything necessarily more mystic about it. It's pretty well explained out. It's like he came here, said what he said. Yeah. It was like the information we have is pretty much where it's at. He died.
Yep.
And then he left.
Yeah.
And I think there's still, don't get me wrong, obviously, I believe there's a great deal more to it than just that.
Right.
But I think sometimes people have this hard idea to be able to wrap their heads around, like, why that actually is so impactful and what is actually so powerful about that idea. But
yeah, I absolutely. I mean, story is powerful and compelling. In there, I'm trying to remember the name of a book. I might have to find it for you later. But basically, the idea that there's kind of one myth of mankind, one great myth of mankind that's retold in so many ways.
Yeah,
it might be Joseph Kim.
A Thousand Faces. It's like
the hero with a thousand faces.
Something like that. That's the name of the book.
So and the kind of, there's this prescribed formula.
Sure.
There's evil, something wrong. A hero has these challenges and deficits. It doesn't look like they'll be able to overcome the evil. But then ultimately, typically through coercive violence, the hero overcomes the the great evil that is existing. It's not always violence, sometimes other forms, but principally in many of the myths, it's violence. Jesus really breaks that mold. In the way that he functions is sort of this anti-hero, where he is not the one who is coming against odds, and then overcoming those odds through violence, through a more noble use of violence, whatever it is, and overcoming the evil one. We see this in Marvel,
More strength.
and more strength, whatever it is, more clever use of violence.
So I'm curious there, because like it seems like to a certain degree he is, but his mission is to save all of humanity.
Right.
So how could he accomplish that if he actually then destroyed half of them?
Yeah.
Right.
No,
So like arguably, like it would seem that okay, like, and maybe I'm wrong in this. Like, isn't his goal
Destroyed
to
half of them? Thanos?
like? No. I mean, like, if Jesus,
Marvel?
right?
I was like, oh, yeah.
like if Jesus' goal, like if he came
Yeah.
in and just like busted the gates down, then he kills half the people he's trying to save.
let me just wipe out the bad guys and leave the good guys.
It's
Right.
like, but that's not what he wants to save all of mankind.
Yeah,
Right,
because
right.
they're all the bad guys. That's the fundamental difference.
Yeah.
And so the story of Jesus is not eliminating the bad guys, and then now all the good guys are free because the oppressive bad guy has been eliminated through violence. The story of Jesus is we are the bad guys, and God is deeply in love with us, and he's trying to remove the bad from the guys.
But he still then presumably has to eradicate sin, though.
Right. So he takes it in himself. Let me absorb, let me take upon sin and its consequences, its weight, and I'll go to the cross, and I'll let your sin die in me, so that ultimately I can get what I'm after, and that's you. But I've got to separate this bad, this toxic thing that is, corrupting and harming and hurting everything that I love. And so the story of Jesus, in many ways, is kind of an it's kind of the opposite direction of the trajectory of most of the great myths of our society, which is one of the things I love about the Gospels. There's all sorts of arguments why do we believe that the Gospels are not just another myth, right? And to me, what human mind comes up with this? It's different. It's a very different sort of story and trajectory, and the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels is so different than the cultural expectation of both Jews and Romans and that society and that world, and in the ancient Near East. And it just there's just so much about it that to me says this is different. He's different. And it makes my heart and my mind and my life want to pay attention.
Yeah, like
powerful.
I was in we were in Rome last year for my dad's 70th, and we did like a tour of like the the underground tombs,
Catacombs.
the catacombs.
Yeah.
And there's this tour guide, and he just explained it so well, just like contextualizing the ways that people approached religion back then. And he's like, all Romans, everyone was spiritual back then.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea was that we as humans and humanity, we sacrifice to the deity.
Yeah.
We sacrifice to the gods.
Right.
And it's like and we have all these gods and we sacrifice to them
Yeah.
in order to get our needs met, in order to be, all that stuff. And then this like small time religion comes about called Christianity, where they're saying, no, the God sacrifices himself to humans.
It flips
it's
the whole
like,
script.
what?
Completely counterintuitive.
And just to kind of maybe this will kind of come back around to the psychology aspect of it. In ancient Rome, the gods were just as dysfunctional as the people, only more powerful.
You're right.
You look at Zeus, and the whole everybody.
They had beef.
There was
they had
always
beef. They had drama.
Yeah.
They had beef.
They needed therapy.
They had anger.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they needed therapy.
Yeah.
And the humans were just subject to the dysfunction of the gods. And you hoped that you could coerce and cajole the gods. You had to kind of play into their dysfunctions and their anger and their, there's this
Whims.
the tribalism and whims among the gods. They're just humanity writ large, right? More powerful. If you took humans and made them eternal beings, you get the gods of Rome, and it's a mess. It's a mess. So Jesus, he comes with the emotions of humans. He's not this stoic robot, right? He's got joy. He weeps. There's anger even at times. There's compassion. He has fear, genuine fear. In Gethsemane when he's looking toward the cross, he experiences the full gamut of human emotions, but he experiences and expresses them in a very different way. He experiences all the temptation. He experiences suffering. Hebrews would say, in all points tempted as we are, he suffered in every way that we had, so that he can understand. And so what you have in Jesus is a God who understands what it's like to be in our sandals, who understands what it's like to be a human with struggles and fears and emotions, and living in the context of people that don't understand and are dysfunctional, and yet even in the midst of that, even in the midst of an unideal circumstance, he lives out an ideal life. He gives us the what the functional life, the good life, the ideal life is supposed to be, and then invites us to be a part of that. And so to me, I do see Christianity. It's got a fundamental difference.
Paradigm shift.
It's a paradigm shift, and it includes the whole being. It's not just the spiritual side. It's the psychological, the whole side of it. God, he loves us and has an intention for our best interest. For our well-being, but that's principally found through reconciling with him and allowing him to begin to redeem all those parts of our lives.
Well, lots there,
yeah,
lots there, and I think plenty more probably for another conversation as well, but not to circle it back too quickly, but I believe we are towards the closure of this wonderful conversation. So
we got like 5 minutes before Dale's phone stops recording, and it's always
stops.
Dale's phone.
it is. I am a work in progress. I will work to redeem my phone. So with that though, Reed, thank you so much for coming on.
It's been fun. My first podcast ever, so thank you for the opportunity.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Fantastic.
It's been a lot of fun. I enjoy listening to you guys, and you guys know I have a lot of respect for you and for what you do, and it's just been fun to be a part of this conversation.
Well, it's reciprocated there, so thank you. All right. Well, I think is that a wrap?
Sadly, yeah.
Sadly,
I mean,
yes,
I have
that's
to,
true.
there's so many other things. I feel like we'll have to have a part 2.
We will at some point. We'll have to bring it back around.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks.
excellent.
Thanks,
Okay.
Reed.
Yeah,
Really
thanks,
good.
guys.
Thank you.
All right.